The second episode opens not in a classroom but in the strange, distorted afterlife that footage takes on once it leaves the place it was filmed and enters the bloodstream of the internet. The phones that were raised in the final act of episode 1, held up by students who thought they were capturing evidence against a man assaulting a child, have done something none of them anticipated. The clips of Nawajin disciplining Junhyung and his friends have spread across every platform in the country, and the footage refuses to land cleanly on one side of the argument. Half the country watches the same 10 seconds of video and sees a hero. A man who walked into a broken institution and did, with his hands, what years of teachers, principals, and parents had refused to do with their voices. The other half watches the identical footage and sees something far more troubling: an unaccountable government agent committing assault on a minor, captured on camera, celebrated as entertainment. Student rights organizations begin issuing statements within hours, demanding the immediate dissolution of the Educational Rights Protection Bureau. The episode frames this opening sequence almost like a newsroom collage: split screens, scrolling comment sections, talk show panels shouting over each other, the unmistakable visual language of a controversy with no agreed-upon truth. This is a sharp piece of writing, because it refuses to let the audience feel too comfortable in its own catharsis. We loved watching Wajin discipline Junhyung. The show knows we loved it. And in this opening sequence, it forces us to sit, even briefly, in the uncomfortable adjacent room where that same act looks like something closer to abuse of power. The drama is, in other words, already arguing with its own premise, and it is smart enough to let other characters voice the argument rather than delivering a clean verdict itself. Minister Choi Gang-suk, the architect of the ERPB, played by Lee Sung-min with the calm of a man who has already decided what he is willing to sacrifice for this project, steps in front of the press to answer for what the country just watched. Before he does, in a small, human touch that softens what could otherwise feel like a stiff political scene, he jokingly blames Wajin for being careless enough to get filmed in the first place. A brief, almost rueful laugh shared between the two men who both know that the optics were never going to be clean, no matter how justified the actions were. Then Gang-suk turns to face the reporters, and the show lets him make his case directly to camera, almost as if he is making it to the audience itself. He does not deny what happened. He does not soften the footage or claim it was taken out of context. Instead, he reframes the entire debate. The real scandal, he argues, is not a single inspector enforcing discipline. It is an education system that has been allowed to decay to the point where a 17-year-old's wealth and political lineage function as full legal immunity, where a student can be driven to suicide and the institutions meant to protect him simply look away. He refuses, flatly, to shut the bureau down. He promises that the ERPB will pursue every bully in the country, regardless of what their parents do for a living. It's a compact, effective scene, the kind that exists to plant a flag in the ground for what the entire series believes it is doing, even as it continues to entertain us with the more visceral pleasures of watching bullies get what's coming to them. And crucially, the show does not let this go unchallenged. Across town, in a much colder, much more private room, members of the opposition party are having a very different conversation about Gang-suk and his bureau. Someone, still simmering, voices what is probably the most honest objection raised by anyone in either of the first two episodes: studying isn't going to help him. It's a real point, delivered without irony, and the show lets it sit in the room for a moment rather than immediately punishing it. For a kid like Songwon, raised in an environment where the most visible success story is a school dropout turned millionaire gangster, the promise that grades lead to a better life is not obviously true. It might even be obviously false. Wajin's response is the episode's cleverest structural choice. Rather than arguing with Songwon's premise, he sidesteps it entirely. He takes the class to the school garage and has them work on repairing a car, leaning into Gun High-Tech as actual identity as a vocational, technical school, the kind of institution that should have been giving these kids real, marketable skills all along instead of simply warehousing them until graduation or arrest. It's a small but pointed argument buried inside an action drama, that part of what failed these students wasn't just absent discipline, but an education system that never bothered to make its lessons feel relevant to the actual lives these kids were going to live. Of course, Sungwon and In-beom aren't done testing him yet. This is, by the near-unanimous agreement of viewers and critics, the single most purely entertaining scene of the episode, repeatedly singled out as a personal favorite in reviews and viewer comments, and for good reason. When Songwon and In-beom continue acting out during the car repair lesson, refusing to take the exercise seriously, Wajin doesn't punish them with another beating. He takes them for a drive. Specifically, he drives them around campus in a car that is, due to the boys' own slipshod, half-finished repair work, missing a door. What follows is a masterclass in comedic tension disguised as an action sequence. Wajin drives recklessly, taking corners hard, accelerating without warning, while Songwon and In-beom scream and scramble and grip onto anything they can reach to keep themselves from being thrown out of the open side of the vehicle. There is no actual danger here in the way the boys believe there is. Wajin is clearly, precisely in control the entire time, but the terror they experience is completely real to them, and that's the entire point. For the first time in the episode, Two boys who have spent their entire adolescence performing fearlessness as a survival strategy are stripped of the performance entirely. They are simply terrified, screaming, begging him to stop. All pretense of toughness evaporated. By the time the car rolls to a stop, something fundamental has shifted. Songwon and Inbeom finally backed down, not because they were beaten into submission, but because they were shown, viscerally, that the bravado holding their entire identity together was always thinner than they wanted to believe. The other students, who watched the whole spectacle unfold, are visibly impressed in a way that reads as something closer to respect than fear. It's the funniest scene in the episode and also, structurally, one of its most important, because it marks the actual turning point where Gun High-Tech's hierarchy begins to crack. In a smaller, quieter beat that reveals something important about Hyungju's character, Songwon and Inbeom target him again, unable to fully let go of old patterns even as the ground shifts beneath them. Hwajin intervenes immediately. But what's genuinely surprising is Hyungju's response. He defends the very boys who have been tormenting him, actively trying to talk Hwajin down, terrified that an escalation will only make his life harder once the ERPB inspector eventually leaves and Gun High-Tech returns to its old order. It's a small moment, but it does real character work. Hyungju isn't a passive victim waiting to be rescued. He has his own theory of how to survive this place, built from years of experience. And that theory says, don't draw more fire than you can absorb. He thanks Gundae afterward for his earlier kindness and the friendship between them. An undercover ERPB officer and a working-class kid who has no idea his new friend is anything other than what he appears to be, becomes the episode's emotional through line, the thing we actually care about underneath all the spectacle of car chases and gym brawls. That night, Songwon and Inbeom decide to make a break for it, sneaking out of the school dormitory to finally meet the man they've been performing for all along, Jang Won-hyuk himself. And in a sharp piece of plotting, it's Gundae, still maintaining his cover, who unexpectedly shows up with exactly the equipment they need to pull off the escape. The two boys, thrilled to have an ally, bring him along, completely unaware that they are inviting the ERPB's own deputy director directly into the heart of the gang they're trying to impress. At the club, Won-hyuk is waiting, and the show finally gives its antagonist a proper introduction, a young man whose entire aura is built on conspicuous, unearned wealth. The kind of charisma that exists specifically to be irresistible to teenagers who have nothing and want everything. Inbeom, in front of him, complains bitterly about the ERPB, framing Hwajin and his methods as nothing but harassment, a description that the audience, having just watched the doorless car sequence, knows is at best incomplete. It's a small but telling detail. Even after everything, the old hierarchy of values hasn't fully died in these kids yet. Some part of them is still auditioning. The confrontation the entire episode has been building toward finally arrives the next day, when Songwon and Inbeom return to school with Won-hyuk himself in tow, making his entrance, characteristically, by riding a motorcycle directly into the school gymnasium. It's a deliberately theatrical image, almost cartoonish in its excess, and that's precisely the point. Won-hyuk's power has always been built on spectacle rather than substance, on the visual grammar of a gangster rather than any real, tested toughness. Hwajin meets him on exactly those terms. Despite Won-hyuk's initial bravado, and the presence of his actual criminal associates, who arrive prepared to back him up with real violence, Hwajin dismantles him completely. The fight that follows, according to multiple reviews, is staged with particular visual flair, reportedly drenched in rain. Hwajin moving through the gangsters in his black suit with the same economy of motion we first saw in the episode 1 hallway. It is the episode's climactic action set piece, and it functions as the visual punchline to everything Won-hyuk represented, all that reputation, all that fear, all that aspirational mythology built up by teenagers with nothing else to believe in, and it collapses the moment someone genuinely dangerous decides to test it. In the aftermath, something genuinely moving happens. The students who spent the episode using Hyungju as a punching bag chasing Won-hyuk's approval finally turn and apologize to him. It's not a grand, redemptive speech, just a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that costs adolescent boys more than they'd ever admit that they were wrong and he didn't deserve what they did to him. The police arrive and arrest Won-hyuk and his associates. The show doesn't dwell on triumph here. It simply lets the dust settle and lets Hyungju finally exist in a school that might actually let him study. Minister Choi announces, in a brief public update, that the ERPB has successfully eliminated the gang problem at Gun High-Tech. New rules are instituted, tattoos must be removed, smoking is banned, motorcycles are no longer permitted on campus. Small, bureaucratic-sounding details that nonetheless represent the dismantling of an entire subculture that had calcified around Won-hyuk's example. Hyungju, we're told, is finally able to focus on his studies, a quiet, unglamorous victory that the episode treats with more genuine warmth than any of its action sequences. For the first time, the full ERPB team gathers together, Hwajin, Gangsuk, Gundae, and the episode allows itself a moment of levity. Gundae complains, in the most relatable bureaucratic comedy beat of the hour, about how much money he personally spent funding his own undercover operation, prompting Gangsuk to flatly tell him to file an expense report while Wajin teases him for the trouble. It's a small, human scene, and it matters precisely because the show has spent the entire episode in such heightened, high-stakes territory. This brief return to ordinary, mundane office friction reminds us that underneath the action hero mythology, these are just people doing an extremely difficult job together.